The morning Birdie Bancroft agreed to marry Calvin Wells, she had exactly $4.32 to her name, a mule named Duchess who was half blind in one eye, and no earthly idea that the quiet, sun-weathered man standing at her fence post was worth more money than she could count in a lifetime. It was the spring of 1882, in the sun-scorched, wind-bitten stretch of land outside Harlow Creek, Texas, where the mesquite trees grew stubborn and low, and the sky went on forever like God had stretched it out personally just to make people feel small. Birdie had come to this land 2 years prior after her father, Elias Bancroft, had died of a fever that moved through the territory like a slow, merciless fire. He had left her the homestead, a modest 160 acres of dryland that grew more dust than wheat, and the promise that the land would take care of her if she took care of it. Birdie had believed him. She still believed him, though the land had tested her faith in ways she had not anticipated. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father, and brown eyes that caught the amber of the afternoon light in a way that made people stop and look twice. She was not the kind of woman who fussed over her appearance, mostly because she did not have the luxury of time or vanity. There were fences to mend and chickens to feed and water to haul from the creek bed that ran half-dry in summer, and every morning she rose before the sun and began the work that never truly ended. She had seen Calvin Wells around Harlow Creek before. He was not an easy man to miss, though he carried himself quietly enough. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone that studded the hillsides. He wore a simple canvas duster and a battered hat, nothing that suggested wealth or status, and he came into town on a plain bay horse without the silver-trimmed saddle that the ranchers who had money liked to show off. He worked, she had heard, for the Wells operation somewhere south of town, though she had never paid close enough attention to the particulars of who owned what in Harlow Creek. She had her own land and her own troubles, and other people's business had a way of being a luxury she could not afford to indulge. The first time he actually spoke to her was not in town, but at her own front fence, on an early morning in March when the air still held the cold bite of winter and her breath came out in soft white clouds. She had been struggling with a section of wire fencing that had come loose overnight, the barbs catching her gloves and the posts leaning at angles that made the whole project feel like a personal insult. She was so absorbed in the battle with the wire that she did not hear him approach until his horse snorted softly behind her, and she whipped around fast enough to send her hat tumbling into the dirt. "Need a hand with that," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary volume. Birdie picked up her hat and squared her jaw. "I have got it managed, thank you." He looked at the fence, which was listing sideways in a way that directly contradicted her statement. "You sure about that?" She looked at him, then looked at the fence, and felt the particular irritation of someone who was entirely in the wrong but did not want to admit it. "What are you doing on my road?" "Cutting across the south corner to get to the creek," he said. "I do it most mornings. You have not been out this early before." This surprised her because she was always out early. She told him so. "I must have missed you," he said simply, and swung down from his horse with the easy motion of a man who had lived in the saddle his whole life. He tied the bay to the fence post on the intact section of wire, pulled off his own gloves, and crouched down to look at the damage. "Ground heaved with the frost," he said. "Post needs resetting." "I know what it needs," Birdie said. "I was getting to it." "Sure," he said. He did not move to help, just crouched there looking at it, which was somehow more irritating than if he had simply taken over. After a moment he looked up at her. "Do you have a spare post? And a tamping bar?" She did have both of those things, and she was not sure whether to be annoyed or grateful when he spent the next 40 minutes helping her reset 3 fence posts and retighten the wire. He worked the way he spoke, quietly and without fuss, and he did not talk unless he had something to say, which Birdie found to be a rare and pleasant quality in a person. Most of the men in Harlow Creek felt the need to fill every silence with their own opinions, whether or not those opinions had been requested. When the fence was done, she offered him coffee because it was the right thing to do, and he accepted because apparently he understood that it was an offering of truce rather than an invitation. They sat on the steps of her porch in the thin morning light, and she learned that his name was Calvin Wells, which she already half knew from seeing him around town, and that he had come through this part of Texas about 3 years back and liked the country well enough to stay. "What is it you do exactly?" she asked. "I run cattle," he said, "and I manage some land." That was all he said about it, and she did not press him. It was not an unusual answer in this part of Texas. Half the county ran cattle and managed land. He came back the next morning and the morning after that, not always stopping, sometimes just touching the brim of his hat as he rode past on his way to the creek. But often enough stopping, often enough tying up that calm bay horse and sitting on her porch steps with a cup of coffee, that Birdie began to find herself listening for the sound of hooves on the road before sunrise. She did not examine this too closely. She was a practical woman, and she did not have time to be anything other than practical. But the heart has its own schedule, and it does not check with the practical mind before making its appointments. By April, he was helping her regularly. Not in a way that felt like pity or condescension, but the way neighbors helped neighbors in a country where the work was too large and the hands were too few. He fixed the squealing hinge on her barn door. He helped her move a section of stone wall that had collapsed over the winter. When her well rope frayed and broke and she spent 2 miserable days hauling water from the creek in buckets on Duchess's back, he appeared with a new rope and a coil of extra cordage without her having said a word to him about it. She asked him how he knew. "Word gets around," he said. "Harlow Creek is too small," she said. He smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it did something to the geometry of his face that made her look away at the middle distance and find something very interesting to observe in the direction of the mesquite trees. What she did not know, what no one had thought to tell her because it was such a common and accepted fact in Harlow Creek that it barely warranted mention, was that Calvin Wells was not merely a man who ran cattle and managed land. He was the man who owned the land, most of it. The Wells operation south of town was not a working operation that employed Calvin. It was an empire that Calvin had built, piece by piece, beginning when he was 19 years old with $200 saved from driving cattle up the Kishom Trail, and a stubborn refusal to accept that a man born with nothing had to die with nothing. By 1882, at the age of 31, Calvin Wells owned 14,000 acres of ranch land, 3 water rights on the creek system that fed half the county, the grain storage facility on the east side of Harlow Creek, and a controlling interest in the Harlow Creek Savings and Trust, which was the only bank within 40 miles. He employed 63 cowboys and ranch hands, a foreman named Douglas Hatch who had been with him since the beginning, a housekeeper named Maria Esperanza who ran the main house with quiet and absolute authority, and a lawyer in San Antonio who handled the sorts of transactions that required careful legal attention. He wore a plain canvas duster and a battered hat because he found ostentation to be a waste of both money and energy, and because the men who worked for him respected a man who worked beside them rather than above them. He had grown up with nothing, and he had not forgotten what it felt like, and he saw no reason to perform wealth when there was always more work to be done. Birdie Bancroft knew none of this. She knew the man who showed up at her fence line before sunrise and drank his coffee black and listened when she talked and did not try to tell her how she ought to run her own land. She knew the man who laughed quietly at her quick, dry humor, who treated Duchess the half-blind mule with the same courtesy he would extend to a fine horse, who once sat with her for an hour on the creek bank, saying almost nothing while she grieved aloud about her father in a way she had not been able to grieve with anyone else. She knew the man with the weathered hands and the careful eyes and the slow, sure way he moved through the world, and she was, against every practical intention she had set for herself, falling in love with him. She tried not to. She made a concerted effort. She reminded herself that love was a complicated business and that she had a homestead to manage, and that a woman in her situation could not afford the distraction. She reminded herself that she did not know him well enough, that he was still in many ways a stranger, that she was a person of sound judgment who did not let herself be carried away by feelings. None of it worked especially well. The afternoon in late April when her hog enclosure burst open, and 3 of her 4 hogs made a determined break for freedom, scattering across the south pasture with the single-minded enthusiasm of animals who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. It was Calvin who appeared over the ridge on his bay horse like something out of a story, read the situation instantly, and spent the better part of 2 hours helping her chase down all 3 escapees through the scrubby mesquite and the dry creek ravines. They were both coated in dust and what was generously described as creek mud by the time the last hog was secured, and Birdie laughed so hard at the expression on Calvin's face when the largest hog reversed direction and ran directly between his legs that she had to sit down on the ground and hold her sides. He stood above her, covered in Texas dust, and looked down at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something open and unguarded, something that made him look younger than his years and less careful than he usually was. "What?" She managed between gasps of laughter. "Nothing," he said, but he was smiling and the smile did not go away. They sat on the porch again that evening, and this time the silence between them was a different kind of silence, the kind that is not empty but full of things that have not yet been said. The sun went down in spectacular fashion, the way it did in that part of Texas, painting the sky in layers of orange and deep rose and a purple that bruised the horizon. A nighthawk called somewhere over the pasture. Duchess made a soft, contented sound from the paddock. "I want to ask you something," Calvin said finally. Birdie kept her eyes on the sunset. "All right. Would you come to the social on Saturday, at the Hendersons' place?" She looked at him then. "Are you asking me to accompany you to the social?" "I am," he said. He looked straight back at her, unhesitating, which was one of the things she had noticed about him. He did not look away from things that other people looked away from. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question and she knew it, but she was a direct person and he seemed to understand that. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I would like to spend an evening with you that does not involve fence posts or escaped hogs," he said. "Though I am not opposed to either of those things." She felt the smile rise on her face before she could do anything about it. "All right," she said. "Yes." The Henderson social was held on the broad, lantern-lit porch of the Henderson Ranch house, which was one of the larger properties west of town, though still modest by the standards that Birdie would later come to understand. There was a fiddle player named Old Mr. Croft who had 3 teeth and the most magnificent musicianship in the county, and a woman named June Purvis who played guitar and sang with a voice like a warm room on a cold night. The women brought food, and the men arranged the tables, and someone always brought too much peach whiskey and not enough lemonade, and the whole affair had the comfortable, worn quality of a thing that had been done many times and would be done many times more. Calvin wore a clean shirt and his hat with the brim straightened, which was apparently the extent of his concession to occasion. Birdie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue calico with white at the collar, and she had taken her hair down and pinned it up again more carefully than usual, and she had the self-awareness to feel mildly embarrassed about how much time she had spent on this. She was a practical woman. She had spent 20 minutes on her hair. He picked her up in a wagon, which was a courtesy she had not expected, and he helped her up onto the seat without making it into a production, and they drove the 3 miles to the Henderson place in the particular comfortable quiet that had become, she realized, their natural register. She did not feel the need to fill the silence with him, and he did not seem to feel the need either, and there was something deeply restful about that. At the social, she noticed things she had not been in a position to notice before. The way people responded to Calvin, the slight but unmistakable shift in posture when he arrived, the deferential nods from the men, the particular attention of people who understood where power resided. She had assumed this was simply a matter of his bearing, which was naturally commanding, but there were small things that accumulated. Jim Reeves, who owned the dry goods, gripped Calvin's hand and called him sir in a tone that was not casual. The Henderson brothers, who were not small men in terms of their own local standing, addressed Calvin with a quality of careful respect that went beyond mere friendliness. Clara Henderson told Birdie quietly, with the conspiratorial satisfaction of someone sharing a known secret, that it was quite something that Calvin Wells had come to the social at all, since he generally did not bother much with social occasions. He must have a reason, Clara said meaningfully, and looked at Birdie in a way that made Birdie's ears go warm. But the evening itself was beautiful, and Birdie did not spend too much time analyzing the undercurrents. She danced with Calvin twice, which required a brief negotiation since she informed him that she was not much of a dancer, and he informed her that he was possibly worse, and they turned out to be a well-matched pair of mediocre dancers who made each other laugh enough that it did not matter. He kept his hand on the small of her back with a courteous, steady pressure, and she was very aware of the warmth of it through the calico of her dress. Walking her back to the wagon at the end of the evening, he said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" she asked. "About asking if I might come to call on you properly," he said, "not just in the mornings on my way to the creek." She stopped walking. He stopped too. They stood in the dark outside the ring of lantern light, the stars over Texas extraordinary and indifferent above them. "Properly," she repeated. "Yes," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I would like to court you, Birdie, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The practical voice in her head was saying things about caution and time and not being hasty. The rest of her was already saying yes. "I think I would be willing," she said. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had been working out for some time. "Good," he said. And then he offered her his arm to walk the rest of the way to the wagon, and she took it, and that was that. He came to call on Tuesday and Thursday evenings through May, arriving after the workday with the day's dust on him and a quiet purpose, and they sat on the porch or walked the fence line of her property in the long Texas evenings, while the light went gold and then pink and then dark. He told her things gradually, in the unhurried way that was particular to him. His childhood in a small dirt-floor house in East Texas, a father who drank and a mother who made the best of it, and 2 younger brothers he had helped raise. The years on the cattle drives, the Kisham Trail when he was 17, the summer that had been so brutal that 3 men in his company died of heat, and one of the trail bosses went blind in one eye from the dust. He had come to Harlow Creek at 19 and seen the land and known it was where he wanted to stay. What he did not tell her, in any specific way, was the scope of what he had built there. He spoke about the ranch in general terms. The cattle operation, the work, the men who worked with him. He mentioned Douglas Hatch, his foreman, as a good man and a trusted friend. He mentioned the land as something he cared about deeply. But he said nothing of 14,000 acres or bank interests or water rights, and Birdie, whose frame of reference for a successful rancher was perhaps a few thousand acres and a decent herd, did not ask questions that would have produced those numbers. She assumed he was comfortable. She was glad for him that he was comfortable. Her own situation was tight, and she would not have wanted him to know the full extent of it. In fact, her situation had grown tighter through the spring. The winter wheat had not come up as she had hoped, and the seed money she had planned to recoup would not materialize until she could sell the hog in the fall. She had been managing on eggs and the small amount she made selling butter and preserves to the Hendersons and to the dry goods store, and there was a payment due on the land in June, a debt her father had carried, and that had passed to her when he died. $80. It was not an insurmountable amount in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of Birdie's finances, it might as well have been $800. She handled this the way she handled everything, methodically and without self-pity. She counted what she had, calculated what was possible, and set about making it work. She had not told Calvin about any of it. She would not tell Calvin about any of it. A woman who allowed a man she was being courted by to solve her financial problems was not a situation she was willing to inhabit, for reasons both practical and deeply personal. Her self-sufficiency was not a performance of strength. It was her genuine nature, and it was also the thing her father had given her most deliberately, the belief that a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet was a woman who chose her company freely rather than out of necessity. But the land payment pressed at the edges of her thoughts in the quiet moments, and she had taken on 2 days a week of laundering for Mrs. Copeland in town, which was hard work that bit into her evenings and left her hands raw, and she was selling eggs at a higher volume than she could comfortably sustain, and still, the number did not quite reach $80. It was Douglas Hatch who, without meaning to, pulled the curtain back. Birdie had ridden into Harlow Creek on a Thursday in late May to collect supplies and deposit the week's laundry earnings at the Harlow Creek Savings and Trust, where she kept her small account. She was standing at the counter when Douglas Hatch came through the door behind her, a big man with a red beard and an honest face, and he greeted her with the familiarity of someone who knew who she was even if they had not properly met. "Miss Bancroft," he said, touching his hat. "How do you do? I am Douglas Hatch. I work for Calvin Wells." "I have heard him mention you," she said, smiling. "He speaks well of you." Hatch looked pleased at this. "He is a good man to work for, I will say that. Best in the county, and I mean that in more ways than one." He chuckled at something in this statement that Birdie did not fully catch. The bank clerk appeared then, a young man named Arthur who was new to the position and trying hard to perform competence. He greeted Hatch with a warmth and a deference that made Birdie glance between them. "Mr. Hatch, good morning. Is this for the Wells account, or is there something particular I can help with?" "Just dropping off some paperwork for Mr. Wells from the land transfer on the Anderson parcel," Hatch said, setting an envelope on the counter. "The whole transaction should clear by end of the month. 2,200 acres and the access road, all properly documented." "Of course," Arthur said, with the careful respect of someone handling something large and important. "I will make sure Mr. Wells receives it directly." Birdie processed this without appearing to process it. 2,200 acres as a casual addendum to a land transfer at the bank that appeared to have Calvin's name attached to it in a very central way. She looked at the teller window, at her small deposit slip, and then at Douglas Hatch's broad and friendly face. "How large is the Wells operation?" she asked. She kept her voice conversational. Hatch looked at her with the slight surprised expression of someone who had just realized he was talking to a person who did not already know the answer. "Well, with the Anderson parcel coming through, just over 16,000 acres all told," he said, "give or take, plus the grain storage and the cattle operation." He paused. "He has not told you much, has he?" It was not quite a question. Birdie looked at him steadily. "He told me he runs cattle and manages land," she said. Hatch made a sound that was half laugh and half something more complicated. "That is accurate," he said. In the way that saying the Pacific Ocean is a body of water is accurate. He seemed to register that this information might be significant to her in some specific way because his expression shifted. "I am sorry, Miss Bancroft. I assumed you knew." "It is all right," Birdie said. And it was in the immediate sense because she was standing in a public bank and she was not going to have feelings in a public bank. "Good day, Mr. Hatch." She rode home with a great deal to think about. 16,000 acres, a grain storage operation, a bank account that the tellers handled with the particular reverence reserved for accounts that had many zeros. She thought about his plain canvas duster and his battered hat. She thought about the way he talked about the ranch like a man talking about work he loved rather than an empire he owned. She thought about the mornings on her porch steps and the evenings walking her fence line and the Henderson social and the 2 dances and his hand on the small of her back and the way he had asked to court her. She thought about what she was going to say to him on Thursday evening. He arrived at 6, as he always did. She was sitting on the porch, and she did not get up to meet him at the fence the way she sometimes did. She waited. He tied his horse, came through the gate and climbed the 2 steps to the porch, and then he looked at her face and stopped. "Something has happened," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat, not in his usual easy way, but with the careful quality of a man who has just noticed the ground might not be entirely stable beneath him. "I spoke with Douglas Hatch today," she said. "In town." He was very still. 16,000 acres, she said, give or take, plus the grain storage and an interest in the bank apparently. The silence stretched between them. A whippoorwill called from the mesquite. Duchess shifted in her paddock. "Yes," Calvin said. "You did not tell me," she said. Her voice was level. She was working hard to keep it level. "No," he said. "Why?" He looked at the board floor of the porch for a moment, then back at her. "Because I wanted you to know me first," he said, "before you knew what I had. Most people, when they know what I have, that is all they see, the land and the money. They talk to me differently. They want things from me. They calculate." He paused. "I did not want you to calculate, Birdie. I wanted you to just see me." She sat with this for a long moment. The anger she had been carrying on the ride home from town, the particular sharp anger of someone who has been kept in the dark, was still present, but it was shifting slightly on its axis. She was too honest with herself not to examine it carefully. "I do not calculate people," she said. "I know that," he said. "I know that now. I knew it fairly quickly, to be honest. But by then I had also come to understand that telling you would make you uncomfortable. You are a proud woman, not in a small way, in the way that matters." This was so accurate that it landed differently than she expected. She had been going to say something pointed about honesty and withholding information, and instead she found herself sitting with the fact that he had read her correctly. That he had known she would not want to be in the position of a woman being courted by a man of enormous wealth while her own finances were a source of quiet anxiety. That he had tried to level the ground between them. "I am still angry," she said. "I know," he said. "You have a right to be. A person should be honest with the person they are courting." "Yes," he said. "They should. I should have told you earlier. I was not being strategic, Birdie. I was being careful, and I held on to that carefulness too long." She looked at him. He looked back at her. That unhesitating quality, that willingness to hold her gaze without flinching from what was in it. "I need to think," she said. "All right," he said, and he stood, and he picked up his hat, and he went back through the gate and mounted his horse without asking her for reassurance or any particular timeline. He rode away in the direction of the South Road, and she watched him go, and the anger and the other thing that had been quietly growing in her all spring, sat side by side inside her and did not resolve themselves quietly. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about the man she had been watching and talking to and sitting with through 4 months of mornings and evenings. She thought about the fence posts and the hog chase and the Henderson social, and the way he had asked her to let him court her like a man asking for something he did not take for granted. She thought about what it meant to be honest and what it meant to be afraid, and how a person could do something that was both of those things at the same time. On Saturday morning, she saddled Duchess and rode south on the road toward the Wells Ranch. She had never been to it. She had known it existed somewhere south of town, but she had not had occasion to go there. And as she rode the miles down the South Road, the scale of it gradually revealed itself to her in a way that required some adjustment. The fencing she passed was not the patched and struggling wire of her homestead, but solid, well-maintained posts and good wire that stretched for what seemed like a very long way. The grazing land on either side of the road was deep and well kept, with cattle visible in the distance in numbers that she estimated at first, then stopped estimating because the estimation was getting unwieldy. When the main house appeared at the end of a long straight road, she took it in with the particular composure of someone who has prepared herself but is still experiencing adjustment. It was not a mansion in any Eastern sense. It was built to belong to the land, long and low with deep verandas on three sides, built of limestone and good wood, with the sort of functional solidity that spoke of permanence rather than display. But it was unquestionably the house of a man with resources, and the range of outbuildings around it, the bunkhouse and the barns and the workshop and the grain storage structures visible in the distance, constituted something she had to adjust her mental map to accommodate. A woman came to the doorway of the main house as Birdie rode up. This was Maria Esperanza, who ran the Wells house with quiet authority and who looked at Birdie approaching on a half-blind mule with an expression that managed to be simultaneously assessing and welcoming. "Miss Bancroft," she said. "Yes," Birdie said, dismounting with the ease of long practice. "Is Mr. Wells here?" "He is in the south pasture," Maria said. "I can send one of the hands." "I will ride out," Birdie said. Maria sent a young ranch hand named Pete to show her the way, and Birdie followed him on Duchess through the well-ordered operation of the Wells Ranch, past the barns where 3 men were repairing harness leather, past the paddocks where a dozen excellent horses moved with the particular beauty of well-cared-for animals, past the bunkhouse where the sound of voices and the smell of morning coffee still hung in the air. She catalogued it all without comment, storing it alongside everything else she was storing. She found Calvin in the south pasture with Douglas Hatch and 2 other hands, working a section of fence that had been damaged by a spooked steer the previous day. He was doing the work himself, his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, setting a post with the tamping bar the same way he had set posts on her property 2 months ago. And when he heard the hoofbeats and looked up and saw her, something moved through his face that was complex and unguarded. He handed the tamping bar to Douglas without looking at it and came to meet her. She dismounted, and they stood in the pasture with the morning sun warm on their faces and the sounds of the cattle and the wind in the grass around them. "I have been thinking," she said. "I thought you might come," he said. There was something careful in him, something held in readiness for whatever she had decided. "I want to say something, and I want you to let me say all of it before you respond," she said. "All right. What you did, not telling me, was wrong," she said. "Not because of the money or the land, but because a person who wants to be known by someone does not get to decide which parts of themselves they show and which they hide. That is not knowing. That is performance." He absorbed this without looking away from her. "But I have also thought about why you did it," she said, "and I understand it. I do not agree with it, but I understand it. You were afraid of being seen as a thing to want rather than a person to know. And I think that fear came from something real." She paused. "I am not a person who would love a man for his land or his money. I think you knew that. I think you knew it before you should have, before you had enough information, and it made you hope, and hope made you hold on to the situation longer than honesty required." Calvin was very still. "I am still angry," she said. "But anger and love can apparently coexist in the same chest, because I have learned that about myself this week, and I am working with it." The word love sat between them in the spring air. "Birdie," he said. "I am not finished," she said. "I came here because I wanted to see this place, because you are this place partly, and I could not know you properly if I was pretending this did not exist. I have seen it now." She looked around at the pasture, at the operation visible in the distance, at the range and scale of what he had built. "It is extraordinary," she said simply. "You built this from nothing. That is not a small thing." "No," he said quietly. "It is not. And I want you to know," she said, "that none of this changes the specific things I feel for you. The particular person I have been sitting with on my porch steps and walking with along my fence line and laughing with about escaped hogs, that person is who I feel what I feel for. This," she gestured at the ranch, "is attached to that person. I am not ignoring it, but it is not the reason." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I respond now?" "Yes." "I was a coward," he said. "Not about the withholding. I was wrong about the withholding, and I would take it back if I could. But the cowardice underneath it was about this." He looked at her steadily. "I have not let myself want something like this in a long time. A person, a specific person. Everything I have built, I built because I understood how to work for it, how to plan for it, how to be patient and persistent. People do not work the way land does. They cannot be acquired by patience and hard work. They make their own choices. The idea of you making a different choice because of what I had or had not told you was—" He paused. "I could not fix it the way I can fix a fence. And that scared me." Birdie looked at him for a long moment. The anger was still there, smaller now, filing itself away into the category of things that had been addressed and could be lived with. The other thing was larger. "You still should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have. Do not keep things from me again." "I will not," he said. "I swear it." She nodded once. "All right," she said. "Then I think we are all right." He let out a breath that told her he had been holding it for longer than just this conversation. Douglas Hatch, who had absolutely been watching from a respectful distance with the strategic interest of a man who had known Calvin for 12 years and had views about his long-term happiness, turned back to the fence post with a satisfied expression that he shared with the two ranch hands, both of whom had the decency to pretend they had not been watching either. June came, and the land payment loomed. Birdie had reached $67, which was remarkable by any honest accounting of her situation, but was still $13 short. She had cut expenses to the bone and taken on every extra job she could find without compromising her actual operation. And on the morning of the 15th, 4 days before the payment was due, she sat at her kitchen table with her account book and her coffee and faced the arithmetic honestly. She was going to have to ask Mr. Fowler at the bank for an extension of 2 weeks, which was something she had never done in her life, and which sat in her stomach like a stone. She was putting on her good hat to go into town and do exactly this when Calvin appeared at her gate, which was his usual habit. He took one look at her face and the hat and the particular set of her shoulders, and he came up the porch steps. "What is wrong?" he asked. She had promised herself she would not tell him. She rehearsed this promise for approximately 4 seconds, and then she remembered what she had said to him in the south pasture about honesty, and she thought about the kind of woman she was trying to be, and she made a different decision. She told him about the land payment and the shortfall. She told him all of it, plainly and without drama. When she was done, she said, "I am going to ask Fowler for a 2-week extension. I can manage $13 in 2 weeks if I take the Coppell family's laundry contract." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "I can give you the $13. "I know you can," she said. "That is not what I am asking you." "I know," he said. He looked at her carefully. "Would a loan be acceptable, with interest and a formal repayment arrangement exactly as you would get at the bank?" She looked at him. He was entirely serious. A loan with interest as a formal transaction between two parties. "That is very precise," she said. "You are a very precise woman," he said. "And your independence matters to you in a way I am not willing to be careless with." Something in her chest opened up like a window in spring. 5%, she said. 2, he said. 4, 3, and we shake on it. She shook on it. He had the money in his coat pocket in exact denominations, as if he had already calculated what she might need and prepared for it, which meant he had been carrying it for days. She did not point this out. She wrote it into her account book as a debt to C. Wells at 3%, and she felt entirely clean about the transaction, which was the only feeling about it she could have tolerated. She paid it back in 6 weeks. July moved through the territory in the long, scorching way of Texas summers, when the days were white with heat, and the evenings brought the only relief. And the evenings belonged to Calvin and Birdie in the particular way that sustained things come to belong to the people who show up for them consistently. He did not spend every evening at her homestead, because he had an operation to run that did not pause for courtship, and she had her own work, and they were both people who understood that love was not a reason to abandon function. But the evenings he did come, they had settled into a warmth and ease that was different from the careful early days, something less guarded and more genuinely inhabited. He had taken to telling her things now, fully, without editing for effect. The complexities of running a large ranch operation in a county where resources were increasingly contested, the trouble with a neighboring rancher named Holt who was making noise about the water rights, the difficulty of a yearling season that had not gone as well as hoped. She listened and she asked questions and she offered opinions, which he received with the particular attentiveness of a man who genuinely wanted them. And she found that she was someone who had views on cattle and water rights that were not uninformed, because she had been running her own land for 2 years and paid careful attention to the forces that bore on it. He valued this. She could tell he valued it, not in the performative way of a man trying to make a woman feel heard, but in the practical way of someone who had found a mind that worked usefully on his problems. "Holt is going to be trouble," she said one evening, after he had explained the water rights dispute in some detail. "He is not fighting about the water, he is fighting about the fact that you have it. Men like that do not want the thing, they want you not to have it." Calvin looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right, my lawyer says the same thing." "Then the solution is not about the water rights document," she said. "The solution is making whatever fight he picks cost more than it is worth to him." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have been a strategist," he said. "I am a homesteader," she said. "It is the same thing with more dust." He laughed, and the laugh was the full, unguarded kind that he was not sparing with, but that still felt like something given rather than performed. And Birdie felt the warmth of it settle through her like the good heat of a winter fire. It was in July, on an evening when the heat had finally broken, and there was a breeze coming up from the south that smelled of rain still days away, that he asked her to walk with him to the creek. They had done this before. It was one of the evening rituals they had developed, the walk down through her south pasture to where the creek ran clear over smooth stones. They sat on the bank in the cooling air and listened to the water, and the nighthawks came out over the pasture, and the first stars appeared in the blue-dark sky. "I want to ask you something," he said. He had said this to her once before at the Henderson social when he had asked her to let him court her. She looked at him. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at the water, and then he turned to look at her with the full, unhesitating quality that was so essentially him that she could not imagine his face without it. "I know we have not been at this long," he said. 4 months properly, 6 if you count the mornings at the fence. "And I know that is not long by most reckonings." "It is not short either," she said carefully. "No," he agreed, "it is not." He paused. "I am 31 years old. I have spent a long time building something without knowing exactly what I was building it toward. I built it because I loved the work and the land and because I needed to prove something to myself. But it has felt like a thing without a center for a long time. And then you." She was very still. "You are the most honest person I have met in a long time," he said, "and the most self-possessed, and the funniest. And you are the only person I have ever wanted to talk to about everything and about nothing with equal enthusiasm." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and brought out something small and held it in his palm. A ring, a simple band with a small inset stone that caught the fading light with quiet, dignified fire. "I would have built you something more elaborate," he said, "but you struck me as a woman who would find something elaborate to be more of an imposition than a gift." Birdie looked at the ring and then at his face. Her heart was doing something large and complicated in her chest. "Birdie," he said. "Will you marry me?" she thought, in the few seconds before she answered, about everything she had learned about him and everything she had learned about herself in the months of knowing him. She thought about the fence posts and the hog chase and the Henderson social and the creek bank and the south pasture, and every morning with coffee on her porch steps. She thought about the man who had ridden to her gate in the mornings not to rescue her, but to be near her, who had kept a secret for the wrong reasons and been honest about those reasons when confronted, who had lent her $13 at 3% interest because he understood that was the only way she could accept it. She thought about the Birdie Bancroft who had come to this land alone and proud and self-sufficient, and she thought about whether saying yes to this man was a compromise of that self-sufficiency or a different kind of wholeness. She thought it was the second thing. She was almost certain it was the second thing. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her, which it had, because he had spent a quiet afternoon with a jeweler in Harlow Creek who had taken measurements from a button he had borrowed from her glove bag, which was a small and perfect piece of thoughtfulness that she would remember for the rest of her life. He kissed her then, for the first time, on the bank of the creek with the nighthawks calling, and the first stars out, and the smell of distant rain in the warm air. And it was not the tentative, uncertain kind of first kiss, but the kind that felt like the confirmation of something already known. The news traveled through Harlow Creek with the comfortable velocity of small-town information, which is to say that by the following Monday morning nearly everyone knew, and the responses were varied and interesting. The women of Harlow Creek, who had long regarded Calvin Wells as a permanently unreachable man, and had made their various peace with this assessment, adjusted their world views with the efficient pragmatism of people who had seen stranger things. The men who did business with Calvin regarded the development with the respectful interest of people noting a significant change in the landscape. Douglas Hatch, when told, shook Calvin's hand with a grip that lasted approximately twice as long as a normal handshake and said, "Best decision you have made since the water rights," which Calvin took as the high compliment it was intended to be. Clara Henderson came to Birdie's homestead the very next day with a pie and a face full of thoroughly satisfied delight. "I knew it," she said, putting the pie on the kitchen table with the conviction of prophecy. "From the moment he brought you to the social." "The social was after months of him coming to my fence every morning," Birdie said. "I know," Clara said, with the expression of someone who had been watching this develop with considerable attention. "Everyone knew. Well, everyone except you." "I was busy," Birdie said, which made Clara laugh until she had to hold the table. The wedding was set for September, which gave them 2 months, and which was enough time if they were practical about it, and they were both practical people. It was to be held at the Harlow Creek Church, a small limestone building that had seen the county through drought and cattle plague and the grief of too many early deaths, and it would be followed by a supper on the church grounds that the women of the community were already organizing with the coordinated enthusiasm of people who had been looking for a good occasion. What Birdie had not expected, and what presented itself as something she was required to navigate with some care, was the social adjustment of being the woman who was marrying Calvin Wells. People who had been pleasant and neighborly with her before were now significantly more attentive. Invitations appeared. Deference that had not previously existed materialized from various directions. She noticed it with a careful, clear eye, and she found it to be one of the less comfortable aspects of the situation. She told Calvin about it one evening in August. She told him that she found the shift in other people's behavior to be a thing she was still learning how to hold, that she was not sure she wanted to inhabit the role of the richest man's wife in the way some people seem to expect that role to be inhabited. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Tell me what you want." "I want to stay who I am," she said. "Then stay who you are," he said. "You do not have to become anything different. You do not have to attend things you do not want to attend or perform a version of this life that doesn't fit you. What I have is yours now, but it is not required to change you." "Your house is very large," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Maria runs it and she is very good at it and she does not need your help unless you want to give it. The house is a place to live, that is all." She thought about her homestead, the small, hard 160 acres that her father had left her. "What happens to my land?" "It is your land," he said immediately. "It remains your land, in your name, whatever you want to do with it." She looked at him for a moment. "I want to keep working it," she said. "Maybe shift it to alfalfa and sell to the cattle operations. There is money in that if the irrigation works." "There is," he said, "and we have the water rights to make the irrigation work." She smiled at that, at the natural way he said we, and he smiled back, and they were both thinking about $13 at 3% interest, and the woman who had insisted on paying it back. She kept her homestead, and they arranged to run it as a supplementary alfalfa operation that fed into the Wells cattle, which was not charity but genuine agricultural sense. Birdie managed it herself with one hired hand, a young man named Samuel whose family had farmed cotton in Alabama before coming west, and she kept her account book and her records with the same meticulous care she had always kept them, and she was answerable to no one about its operation except herself. The September wedding was a Tuesday, because Birdie had looked at the calendar and noted that on a Saturday half the county would spend the following day unable to work, and this was inefficient. Calvin agreed without argument. Douglas Hatch later said this was the moment he knew for certain they were perfectly matched. The church was full. The limestone walls seemed to hold the warmth of the September sun, and the light came through the two narrow windows in long, golden bars that landed on the wooden pews, and the altar with the quality of something deliberate. Clara Henderson had organized flowers, prairie flowers mostly, goldenrod and Indian paintbrush, and the last of the summer's wild asters, arranged with the cheerful abundance of someone who genuinely loved occasions. Birdie wore a dress she had made herself, pale cream with fine blue embroidery at the cuffs and collar, and she had her hair up under a hat that was not her father's working hat but a proper hat in cream with a blue ribbon, and she looked like exactly who she was, a woman who had made her own life in hard country and was choosing, from a position of fullness rather than need, to share it. Calvin stood at the altar in a good suit, dark wool, the finest thing she had ever seen him wear, and he still managed to look like himself in it, like a man who wore good clothes with the same uncomplicated ease with which he wore everything else, without performing it. When she came down the aisle, he looked at her with an expression that she would think about for the rest of her life. It was not the overwhelmed, undone expression that people sometimes wore at weddings, the expression of being surprised by emotion. It was quieter than that. It was the expression of someone recognizing something they have been waiting for without fully knowing they were waiting. The preacher read the words. Calvin said his vows in the clear, unhesitating way he did everything, looking directly at her. She said hers in her own clear voice, not looking away. When the preacher pronounced them married, the small congregation made a sound that was warm and complete, and Douglas Hatch in the front pew had an expression on his face that he would have described as dust in his eye if anyone had mentioned it. Calvin kissed her in the plain, certain way of a man who had nothing to perform and everything to mean, and Birdie Wells, who had been Birdie Bancroft, felt the particular wholeness of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were going but recognize completely. The supper on the church grounds ran until dark and past it, because old Mr. Croft brought his fiddle and June Purvis brought her guitar, and the evening had no intention of ending at a convenient hour. They danced better than they had at the Henderson social, or perhaps they did not dance better but cared less about the quality of the dancing, which amounted to the same thing. Birdie ate 3 pieces of Clara Henderson's pie and had no regrets about this. Calvin was pulled into conversation after conversation, the county's various business and agricultural interests expressing their felicitations with the particular warmth of people who had a stake in his goodwill, and he handled all of it with the same easy, unhurried courtesy, and then came back to Birdie each time, as if resetting to his natural compass point. When they finally left, driving south in the wagon under the enormous Texas stars, Birdie sat beside him and felt the full quiet settle around them, the specific quiet of two people who are not trying to fill silence with anything, who are simply present in it together. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "It is a very large house," she said. "It is," he said. "Maria is not going to know what to make of me," she said. "Maria told me 2 weeks ago that you were the most sensible woman she had encountered in this county," he said. "She is looking forward to it." This surprised Birdie pleasantly. "How would she know that? She has only seen me twice." "She talked to Douglas," he said. "And Douglas talks to anyone who will listen about you, apparently, because he considers himself personally responsible for the whole business, due to the bank conversation. Birdie laughed at this, at the image of Douglas Hatch delivering field reports on her character to the Wells household, and Calvin laughed too, and they drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable, golden warmth of people who have just done something large and right. Maria Esperanza did know what to make of Birdie, as it turned out. She made of her someone to be respected, and gradually, someone to be genuinely fond of. The main house adjusted to the presence of a woman who was not interested in managing the household in competition with Maria, but who brought her own kind of energy to the place, who sat at the table in the mornings with coffee and the account books from both the Wells ranch and her own alfalfa operation, and worked through them with focused attention, who asked Douglas Hatch direct questions about the ranch operation and remembered the answers, who spent her mornings at the homestead property and her afternoons at the main ranch, and seemed to thrive on the scope of the combined work in the way some people thrive on the particular size of their life's challenge. She learned the ranch, not because anyone required her to, but because it was connected to Calvin and she wanted to understand the things that were connected to Calvin. She learned the cattle operations, the seasonal rhythms of breeding and calving and driving, the particular mathematics of water allocation in dry country, the politics of the county's ranching interests. She had views about all of it, and she shared them, and Calvin listened and Douglas Hatch listened, and sometimes they agreed, and sometimes they didn't, and the arguments were useful regardless. The water rights dispute with Holt came to a head in the winter of 1882, when Holt filed a legal challenge to the allocation that had been in place since before Calvin had arrived in the county. Calvin's lawyer came up from San Antonio, and the two of them sat at the big table in the main house with the documents spread out, and Birdie sat at the end of the table and listened to the whole thing. "What is Holt actually running on his property?" she asked. The lawyer, a careful man named Carver, looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was politely assessing. "Cattle primarily. How many head?" "Approximately 300, we believe." At 300 head in that acreage with his grass quality, he does not need more water than his current allocation, Birdie said. He is not challenging the allocation because he needs the water. He is challenging it because a favorable ruling gives him something to sell. She looked at Calvin, who has been making noise about wanting water rights in this county. Calvin was very still. "There are 2 railroad survey teams in the territory," he said slowly. "They need water station rights." "Yes," she said, "Holt is not fighting you for the water. He is fighting you to acquire something he can turn around and sell to the railroad." There was a silence at the table. Carver looked at Birdie with an expression that had shifted from politely assessing to significantly more attentive. "If that is the case," Carver said, "then there is a different legal avenue to consider." It was. The railroad interest was confirmed within 6 weeks through careful inquiry, and Carver pursued a course that made the legal challenge not just unwinnable for Holt but actively costly, and Holt withdrew the challenge before spring. Calvin gave Birdie full credit for the analysis. She told him she had simply paid attention, which was all she had ever done, and which was in fact the most useful thing a person could do in almost any situation. The first winter of their marriage established the texture of the life they were building, and it was a life that both of them had the honesty to say, to each other and to themselves, was good in a way they had not quite expected. Not easier than the life before, because they were both people who would not have been satisfied with ease, but more whole, more various. There was more to think about and more to care about, and the caring was shared in a way that did not have it but somehow deepened it. Calvin had not talked much in the early months about what he wanted for the future. He was not a man who expressed wants in abstract terms. But in December, in the long evenings when the fire was lit and the work was done and they sat together in the comfortable silence that was theirs, he talked about what he had imagined when he thought about the land and what it might become. Not more acreage necessarily, though he would not be opposed to it. What he imagined was the land lasting, a thing that persisted through seasons and difficulties, that grew in quality even if not always in size, that meant something to the people who worked it. And children, he said. He said it quietly, as though it was a thing he had been holding carefully and was now setting down where she could see it. Birdie looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He looked at her across the fire. "I did not know how to want something like that for a long time," he said. "It seemed like something that could be taken away." "Everything can be taken away," she said. "That is not a reason to not want it." He nodded, and she could see him absorbing this in the way he absorbed things that mattered, slowly and with his full attention. In the spring of 1883, Birdie found herself expecting their first child, which she confirmed with a certainty some weeks before she told Calvin, because she wanted to be sure. She told him on a Tuesday morning in April, sitting on the porch of the main house with coffee, in the same simple, direct way she told him most things. He went very still. Then he put his coffee cup down with great care, as if it were made of something fragile, and looked at her. "When?" he said. "October," she said. "Give or take." He took her hand, both of her hands, and held them in his with that focused, complete attention he brought to things that mattered to him most. He did not have a great deal to say. The feeling was too large for most words, and they both understood that. And so they sat in the April morning with the coffee going cold and the sound of the ranch waking up around them. And they were both, in their separate and private ways, very full. He was considerably more solicitous of her well-being over the following months than she found strictly necessary, which she told him frankly, and he acknowledged frankly, and he continued to be solicitous, because he could not entirely help it, and she allowed it because it came from a place that was genuine and not condescending. Her alfalfa operation did well that summer. The irrigation worked as she had expected it to, feeding the well-zoned cattle operation with a consistent supply that Douglas Hatch said took a meaningful cost out of the summer feed budget. Samuel turned out to be an excellent worker with a good instinct for both the crop and the equipment, and Birdie managed the operation from the main house on the days when the pregnancy made the ride to the homestead impractical, which was later in the summer and only a few weeks. She was not a woman who gave up her work unless genuinely required, and this was not a quality Calvin tried to argue out of her, because he understood it was not negotiable. The baby arrived in early October, a boy, on a morning when the first cool air of autumn had come in from the north, and the sky was the particular deep blue of Texas fall. He was a healthy, loud, opinionated baby from the first moment, which both parents found to be extremely on brand. They named him Elias Calvin Wells, for Birdie's father and for his own, and from his first week of life he was regarded by Douglas Hatch as a personal charge, and by Maria Esperanza as a sacred responsibility, and by Duchess the mule, who could see him through the paddock fence, with a benign and ancient equine interest. Calvin held Elias on the evening of his birth with the expression of a man who has encountered something that requires an entirely new category of feeling. He held him very carefully, the way he had put down the coffee cup on the morning Birdie had told him, with the great care of something precious and irreplaceable. "He is very small," he said. "He will not always be," Birdie said from the bed, tired and clear-eyed and entirely present. "I know," Calvin said. He looked up at her. "How are you?" "I am very well," she said, "and very hungry. Is there any of Maria's soup left?" There was soup, and Calvin sat beside her while she ate it and held Elias, and the October evening outside the window went dark in its gradual way, and the Wells Ranch was quiet around them in the manner of a place that has received something good. The years that followed were built on the foundation of that October evening in a way that was not dramatic, but was deeply real. Elias was followed 2 years later by a girl they named Clara Rose, for Clara Henderson, who had brought the pie and the delight on the morning after the engagement, and who cried so thoroughly at this honor that she had to leave the room. Clara Rose had her father's unhesitating calm and her mother's quick, dry humor, a combination that presented fascinating results as she grew older and became capable of expressing both at the same time. The Wells Ranch grew, not extravagantly, but steadily, acquiring the Anderson parcel that had been in process when Birdie met Douglas Hatch at the bank, and later a smaller parcel on the creek that brought additional water rights which Birdie negotiated in a meeting with 3 other ranchers, and a county official that Carver the lawyer later said was the most effective negotiation he had witnessed in 15 years of Texas land law. The railroad came through the county in 1885 and did not get Holt's water station because Holt had overplayed his hand 2 years prior and was no longer in a position to negotiate anything of value, a development that no one at the Wells Ranch found distressing. Birdie's alfalfa operation expanded to include a second 100 acres of the homestead property, and she negotiated supply contracts with 2 other cattle operations in the county that made it a genuinely profitable independent enterprise. She kept her own account book and her own account at the Harlow Creek Savings and Trust, maintained in her own name, which she found both practically useful and symbolically important. Calvin found it excellent in every way, which she had known he would. The Harlow Creek Savings and Trust, in which Calvin held a controlling interest, required more of his attention as the county grew and the railroad brought new commerce. There were discussions about expanding the bank's capital base and bringing in additional investors, and Calvin handled these with the steady patience that characterized everything he built. And Birdie sat in on several of the key discussions at his request and offered opinions that Carver had begun to regard as indispensable. "She thinks like a lawyer," Carver told Calvin once, with the admiring exasperation of a man who has encountered a natural competitor. "She thinks like herself," Calvin said, "which is better." Clara Henderson, who had been Birdie's closest friend since the pie on the morning after the engagement, came to the Wells Ranch every other Thursday for an extended supper that was nominally about neighborly visiting, and was actually about the 2 women talking through everything from ranch management to county politics, to the particular challenges of raising children in a country that was changing as fast as Texas was changing. The railroad had brought new people and new money and new assumptions, and the old rhythms of the cattle country were shifting under the pressure of all of it. And Birdie and Clara watched it and talked about it with the careful attention of women who understood that their lives were embedded in these shifts, whether they participated in the conversation or not. The injustice that sat hardest with Birdie was not any single thing, but a pattern she noticed with increasing clarity as the county grew. The Mexican families who had worked the land in this part of Texas since before most of the Anglo settlers arrived were being pressed off their holdings by legal mechanisms that were technically correct but fundamentally exploitative, land titles challenged on technicalities, water access denied, lease terms altered without fair notice. Several of the ranch families in the county had benefited from this pattern, acquiring land at prices that reflected dispossession rather than fair value. She brought it to Calvin one evening when Elias was 3 and Clara Rose was nearly 1, and the house was finally quiet. "The Garza family is losing the South 40, she said. Pelton filed on the title." Calvin knew about the Garza family. Everyone did. Manuel Garza had worked that land for 20 years, his father for 20 before that. "Yes," he said, "I heard. Pelton's title challenge is legitimate under the current statute," she said, "but the statute is wrong." He looked at her carefully. "What do you want to do?" "I want to see if Carver can find anything," she said. "In the title history, something that holds." Carver found something. It took 2 weeks and a trip to the county records that required significant patience, but the Garza family's original grant document, filed under the Spanish land grant system that predated Texas statehood, was recoverable and legally cognizable under a treaty provision that Pelton's lawyer had either not known about or hoped no one else did. Carver filed the counter-documentation, and the challenge collapsed. Manuel Garza came to the Wells Ranch to thank them, a man in his 50s with a weathered dignity that Birdie had a great deal of respect for, and he brought 3 of his sons and a quantity of the best tamales anyone at the Wells Ranch had ever eaten, and the afternoon had the warm, slightly complicated quality of good being done in the context of a system that had not been built to make it easy. Calvin paid Carver's fees without making it an issue. Birdie wrote a letter to the county commissioner that was carefully worded and thoroughly argued, and made clear that the Wells' interests were not served by a county that treated its longer-established residents as expendable, which was both true and useful framing. By 1887, Harlow Creek had grown from a small town into something approaching a genuine small city, with 2 hotels and a school that had 3 teachers and a commerce that reflected the railroad connection and the county's growing prosperity. The Wells name was attached to a great deal of this growth, not just in terms of wealth but in terms of the specific shape of how it had grown, the choices that had been made about which operations to support and which land uses to encourage, and where the water went. Birdie had opinions about all of it, and they were good opinions, and Calvin had long since understood that including her in every significant decision produced better outcomes than not. She was 30 years old in 1888. Calvin was 37. Elias was 5 and Clara Rose was 3, and both of them were entirely too interesting and entirely too fast, and the ranch could no longer be considered large in the sense of empty, because it was thoroughly populated by 2 small persons who had views about everything and the vocabulary to express them. Elias was very like his father. He watched and listened and moved through the world with a steadiness that was remarkable in a 5-year-old, though this steadiness was punctuated by the particular enthusiasms of childhood, for horses particularly, and for the company of Douglas Hatch, who had by this point essentially appointed himself the boy's honorary uncle. Clara Rose was very like her mother. She had views. She had very early developed the habit of asking questions that adults found difficult to answer without condescension, and she was not willing to accept condescension, which was a quality that her mother found entirely unsurprising and her father found magnificent. There was an afternoon in the autumn of 1888 when all of it was present in the same moment. Birdie was at the porch of the main house with her account books. Calvin came in from the south pasture on the bay horse, which was a younger bay now, the original having lived a long and excellent life, and retired to an honored paddock at the age of 20. Elias was in the paddock with Douglas Hatch learning to properly saddle a horse, a lesson that was proceeding with great seriousness on both sides. Clara Rose was sitting on the porch step with a frog she had caught in the creek, and was explaining something to it, which it did not appear to fully appreciate. Calvin tied his horse at the gate and came up the path and stopped at the foot of the porch steps to look at his daughter, who looked up at him with Birdie's exact expression. "He does not listen," Clara Rose said about the frog. "Animals are like that sometimes," Calvin said. "People are like that sometimes too," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "They are." She considered this and then released the frog in the direction of the flower bed, which she apparently felt was a reasonable compromise. She then went inside, presumably in search of the next thing that needed investigating. Calvin came up the porch steps and sat beside Birdie, who had been watching this with the quiet appreciation of someone who knows they are inside a moment worth remembering. "How was the south pasture?" she said. "Good," he said. "Grass is holding well for November." "The Jennings parcel still on the table," she said. This was a small operation that had come up for sale, 20 acres adjacent to the south fence that would clean up a boundary issue they had been working around. "Carver is handling the paperwork," he said. "Should close by end of year." She nodded and made a note in the account book. He watched her write it, the quick, sure hand she had always had, the meticulous column of numbers that she kept as carefully as she kept everything. "Birdie," he said. She looked up. He had the expression he had worn on the Henderson social dance floor, that open and unguarded thing that made him look younger than his years. "I am very glad," he said, "that I was riding past your fence that morning." She looked at him for a moment. 6 years. A boy named Elias and a girl named Clara Rose, and 16,000 acres that had grown to something larger, and a bank, and an alfalfa operation that was her own, entirely her own. A man who held her coffee on the mornings she was slow to wake and argued with her about cattle management with genuine investment, and sat beside her in the difficult moments without trying to fill them with false comfort. "You came back every morning," she said. That was the relevant part. "You made very good coffee," he said. "I still do," she said. He smiled, she smiled. The porch held the warmth of the autumn afternoon sun, and from the paddock they could hear Elias asking Douglas Hatch a question about horses with the serious intensity of a child who intended to know everything there was to know. And from inside the house, they could hear Clara Rose asking Maria Esperanza a question about something with equal intensity. The account book lay open between them with its careful columns, and his hand was beside hers on the porch railing, and the ranch stretched south and west and north in the long, late light, and everything that had been built here, by both of them together and each of them separately, was present in the specific weight of the afternoon. Birdie put her hand over his. She had said yes on a creek bank in July of 1882 with no idea, no real understanding, of the material fact that was attached to this man. She had said yes to the man who sat with her through grief and fixed fence posts and chased hogs through the scrubby mesquite, and loaned her $13 at 3% interest, because it was the only way she could accept it. She had said yes not because of the land or the money or the weight of the well's name, but because of the particular person underneath all of that, the careful, unhesitating, honest man who had wanted to be known before he was assessed. The land and the money were real. 16,000 acres and a bank and a grain operation and water rights, and all of it were real, and she had come to understand them fully and inhabit that understanding without apology or pretense. But none of it was what she had said yes to. She had said yes to the man who showed up at her fence before sunrise and did not pretend the fence was not falling down. And that man, who was all of those things, who was the richest man in the county, and who she had not known was any such thing until after she had already said yes, sat beside her in the October afternoon and looked at her hand on his with the expression of someone who is entirely, completely home. In the spring of 1889, Birdie discovered she was expecting again, and this time she told Calvin the same morning she was sure, because she did not keep things from him. He set down whatever he was holding, which was a bridle that needed new stitching, and turned to look at her with the full, focused warmth that was so particularly his. "June," he said. "July," she said. "I think July." He crossed the room and folded her into his arms with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been doing this long enough to know it is exactly right. And she leaned into him in the way she had allowed herself to lean for 6 years, not because she could not stand on her own, but because this was the difference, this particular person who made the leaning a choice and not a concession. The July baby was another boy, loud and bright-eyed and immediately opinionated, who they named Hector James Wells. James for Calvin's youngest brother, who had followed him to Texas 2 years prior and was working a small property of his own 20 miles south. Hector James was, from approximately the second week of his life, the primary object of interest for both Elias and Clara Rose, which served him alternately well and poorly depending on the day and the nature of the interest. Douglas Hatch, who had been at the Wells Ranch for long enough to have known the property before the main house had a proper veranda, looked at the 3 Wells children at a Sunday supper in the fall of 1889 and said to Calvin, with the comfortable authority of a man who has been a witness to a life, that this was the best outcome he could have imagined for any of it. Calvin looked at Birdie across the table, where she was managing a conversation with Elias about why frog transportation was not appropriate at supper, while simultaneously reviewing a supply contract that she had been given that morning, because she was a woman who could do 3 things at once and did not particularly regard this as remarkable. "Yes," Calvin said, "it is." The Harlow Creek Social and Agricultural Fair of 1890 was the largest the county had yet held, 3 days of competition and commerce, and the particular shared enjoyment of a community that had built something worth celebrating. The Wells family attended all 3 days, which was notable because Calvin Wells did not generally attend all 3 days of anything, and which was unremarkable to Birdie, because she had things she wanted to see on all 3 days, and Calvin came with her. She entered her alfalfa in the forage category and won the blue ribbon, which she accepted with the understated satisfaction of someone who had known the result was likely but still found the confirmation pleasant. Elias won the junior horse handling competition, which Douglas Hatch watched with the proprietary pride of a man who had taught every technique being demonstrated. Clara Rose entered a drawing competition with a rendering of Duchess the mule that was both technically impressive for a 7-year-old and deeply affectionate, and won the junior art prize, and spent the rest of the day carrying the ribbon with an air of justified vindication. Duchess herself, now 17 years old and more than half blind in the good eye as well, had been retired to the most comfortable paddock on the Wells property, where she received carrots from Elias and conversation from Clara Rose, and had lived out her years with the dignity befitting an animal that had carried Birdie Bancroft through 2 years of hard country before that country got any easier. On the last evening of the fair, there was music and dancing on the fairgrounds, and Birdie and Calvin danced again, better than they had at the Henderson social 8 years prior, or at least with more practiced ease, and they were both aware of the specific pleasure of having a long history with a person, of dancing with someone whose presence was so familiar that the dancing is simply an extension of all the other things you do together. The account books and the fence posts and the long evenings and the children and the arguments about cattle and the mornings with coffee before the work begins. Old Mr. Croft had died 2 years prior, and his fiddle had passed to his grandson, who was not as accomplished but was enthusiastic and improving, and June Purvis still played guitar and sang, though her hair was gray now, and her voice had deepened into something even warmer. The lanterns swayed in the September breeze, and the Texas sky above the fairgrounds was enormous and full of stars, and the county of Harlow Creek danced in the light of them. Calvin held Birdie with the easy certainty of a man who has been doing something long enough to do it without thinking. She leaned into him in the particular way she had, the way that was entirely voluntary and entirely complete. "Happy," he said. He asked her this sometimes, not as a question about the day or the moment but about the whole of the thing. "Yes," she said. She meant it in the full sense, not the comfortable sense or the contented sense but the genuine sense, the sense of a life that had grown into its own shape and was inhabited fully. The dance ended eventually, and they gathered their children, who were in various states of exhaustion and overstimulation, and Calvin lifted Hector James onto his shoulder, where the boy immediately fell asleep, with the absolute trust of very small children who are certain that the people carrying them will not drop them. Elias walked beside Douglas Hatch, still talking about the horse handling competition. Clara Rose walked beside Birdie with her blue ribbon and her characteristic expression of someone evaluating the day's information. "When I have a ranch," Clara Rose said, "I am going to have more alfalfa than anyone." "That is a good plan," Birdie said, "and the best horses, also good. And a mule," she added, "a proper one, like Duchess." Birdie looked at her daughter, who had her father's steady eyes and her own determined jaw, and felt the specific kind of love that has no adequate word, the love for a person who is both deeply familiar and entirely their own. "We will find you a good one," she said. They walked back to the wagon in the September dark, the fairground lights diminishing behind them and the ranch waiting ahead in the south, and all of it, the land and the children and the years and the life they had built, was present in the simple forward motion of walking toward home. That night, after the children were settled and the house was quiet, Birdie sat for a moment on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in the lamplight. The ring was still on her finger, the simple band with the quiet stone, and she had worn it every day since July of 1882 through fence posts, an alfalfa harvest and 3 births and 16,000 acres, and the particular ongoing dailiness of a life that was full in every direction. Calvin came in from checking the horses, which was a thing he did every night because it was a thing he had always done, and he looked at her and read her face with the accuracy of 8 years of careful attention. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I did not know," she said. "When I said yes, I did not know any of it, the land or the money or the weight of the whole business." "I know," he said. He sat beside her. "I am glad I did not know," she said. "I am glad I said yes to the man who fixed my fence posts and chased my hogs and loaned me $13 at 3% interest. I am glad that is what I knew." He took her hand. The lamplight was warm and the house was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a large place that is fully inhabited, and outside the window the ranch stretched out in the dark, the cattle on the pasture and the horses in the paddock, and the alfalfa that she had planted in the fields that had been her father's, now producing something useful and fine. "I am glad too," he said. He looked at her with the expression that was his most particular expression, the one she had first seen in the pasture with the hogs, the open and unguarded one that made him look younger than his years. "I built all of this," he said, gesturing at the general fact of 16,000 acres and a bank and all the rest of it, "and none of it was complete until the morning I rode past your fence, and you were fighting with the wire, and you would not admit it was winning." She laughed, and the laugh was the real kind, the kind that had been there from the beginning, from the porch steps and the coffee and the particular morning light of Texas Springs. "The fence was definitely winning," she said. "It was," he said, "and you were magnificent about it." She looked at him, this man she had known in the full sense of knowing, and she felt the thing that had been growing since the first fence post and the first coffee cup and the first dance at the Henderson social. The thing that had deepened through courtship and engagement and wedding and children and years of shared work and shared life. The thing that was not a feeling exactly but more like a fact, a geological fact of the sort that underlies the surface of the land and does not shift even when the surface does. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and the lamp burned low, and outside the window the stars were brilliant over the ranch, over her alfalfa and his cattle and their children sleeping in the rooms down the hall, over the land that had been built from $200 and a stubborn refusal, and that now carried the weight of everything they had made together. Birdie Bancroft had said yes before she knew. And everything that came after was the proof that not knowing had been exactly the right way to find out.